Hello, my name is Denny May, and I'm a due process consultant with Kentucky Valley Educational Cooperative. In today's training, we'll be providing you with information around accommodations, how those accommodations are selected, verified, and provided not only in the classroom, but in state testing situations. So the objectives for today's training include being able to distinguish accommodations from modifications, and kind of looking at the historical background of providing these accommodations through testing and also in the classroom to provide access to the general curriculum. We'll also understand the responsibilities of the IEP team and how in making these accommodation decisions we have to provide verifiable information that support the use of these not only in the classroom but also on state testing. We'll look at state testing and we'll look at both the paper and pencil and online versions and make sure that we understand what our responsibilities are around those testing times. So in special education, we have a twofold charge to provide both high quality instruction, specially designed instruction if you will, from the IEP that seeks to bridge the gap from present level to similar age performance. And then also we have a charge of providing access to the general curriculum, and we do that by providing these accommodations that level the playing field both in the classroom and on state assessment. So the information on this page seeks to provide you with a historical perspective around the disabilities movement in this country that is also housed in the movement to provide equal access for education for all folks. Born out of the Civil Rights Act, the Special Education Acts came about just a little bit later in the 1970s with Public Law 142 and Congress's enactment of laws that would provide a free, appropriate public education for all students, including students with disabilities. And as we moved forward, we saw a reauthorization of this Education Act in 2001 with No Child Left Behind. And what that act did was it seeked to make sure that the disability population would be tested along with everyone else. We do realize that there were some problematic things with No Child Left Behind with their focus on scores instead of growth and progress. And as the leadership changed, we saw in 2015 the Every Child Succeeds Act, which in fact loosened some demands on states but did not remove accommodations for testing for students with disabilities. They did include the career and college readiness piece and some TSI and TSI schools that where there was some focus on making sure that there was some results-driven accountability. And as we move forward, results-driven accountability is kind of where OSEP stands today, a push to focus on progress monitoring, focus on the use of accommodations, and look to see that the students are in fact are learning what we're intending for them to learn and that we're closing the achievement gap for all. So No Child Left Behind has an impact that when we do IEP meetings, we have to make determinations around what accommodations are appropriate for what students. These have become a vital part of the IEP 504 meeting process, and it helps to facilitate these students access to grade level instruction and full participation in state and district assessments. No Child Left Behind made sure that all students were being tested. So in seeking to understand accommodations are simply tools and procedures that provide equal access to instruction and assessment for students with disabilities. Accommodations then are adaptations or changes to educational environments and practices designed to help students overcome the challenges presented by their disabilities. Now, we're seeking to level the playing field for students with disabilities. It may be as simple as providing a pencil grip for a student who has some difficulty with fine motor skills. And it may be also as involved as providing braille materials for a student with a visual impairment. So we need to have those conversations in ARC meetings and make sure that we're on the right track and providing the right thing at the right time. With this in mind, it's important to recognize that accommodations do not change what students learn, but rather how they access that learning. In summary, accommodations do not change the expectations for learning, they do not reduce the requirements of the task, and they do not change what the student is required to learn. That being said, Teachers should provide accommodations that meet the unique needs of each individual student. That's why it's so important that when we meet in our IEP teams and our 504 teams that we discuss what exactly it is they need per student so that it's unique to the child. Every disability will not require the same accommodation. It will not provide the same barrier for the student. For example, not all students with visual impairments will benefit from Braille materials that we talked about earlier, but some might be better served by enlarged print or audio books. This slide provides some examples. For the disability category, it also tells you what the barrier is and what an example accommodation might look like for that particular disability category. As we see here, if we go down to ADHD, the barrier is remaining focused, staying on task, being able to complete assignments. In this instance, we need to discuss how we can provide the student with the time that they need to complete these tests and complete the actual tasks that are involved so that they can show what they know. We do recognize that the laws that have been enacted in regards to special education and special education students have in fact increased the number of students that are being tested just like everyone else. There still are some problems and barriers that we face. In this slide here we see that inhibited access can be seen in a lot of ways, and so accommodations are generally grouped into the following categories: presentation, response, timing, scheduling, and setting. As you see, when we're talking about presentation, we're talking about how we're getting the information across to the students. What types of presentation are we using and what types of accommodations would make that presentation available to the student on a level playing field. Response is how that student's responding back to us. Do they need some accommodation in regards to how they respond back to us through maybe marking their answers in a book or using reference aids, pointing, using the computer, whatever it might be. And then we look at timing and scheduling. We understand that sometimes students, in order to have equal access, need extended time. They need the ability to say what they know and provide answers for what they know, but they need just a little more time to do that. Or they may need breaks because they have some lack of vitality or muscle tone, whatever it might be. But those are certainly some issues that we need to be aware of and make sure that we're providing the correct amount of time and scheduling. And then the setting. Sometimes we need to talk about whether or not the student's going to do as well in a small group or one-on-one, or do they need a study carrel, do they need special lighting, do they need a separate room. So those are all things to consider when we're looking at inhibited access for students with disabilities. So as we look at this particular graphic representation for equality and equity in providing accommodations to students, sometimes you may hear it in conversations around school that it's not fair to give these students all these accommodations. We're skewing the test. But that's really not the intent here. The intent is to have all students equally tested, but then also to provide the scaffolding needed for students with disabilities to show what they know in an equitable manner. It's very important that we understand the difference. So what is equity? Equity is that they give each student what he or she needs to successfully complete a given learning task or assignment. By promoting equity, teachers can break down the barriers that interfere with students' opportunities to access learning and to also show what they know. We want to know what they've learned. That has to be the end to end all ends. So in providing this equity, providing this scaffolding, we are not in fact being unequal in our presentation, but we're giving them everything that the student needs to be successful. Equality then is giving every student precisely the same thing all the time. So that would be to give everybody in your classroom the same test without any accommodations. Those may be the best intentions to be fair, but sometimes we may be being unfair and not really realize it. So equity seeks to level the playing field, and equality then is to make sure that everybody is in fact being tested. However, by doing so, educators sometimes inadvertently limit the opportunities of students with disability to access learning without really even thinking about it. Now let's turn our attention to a discussion about modifications and how modifications differ from accommodations. Sometimes we use those terms interchangeably and it's confusing. So let's make a distinction here by understanding that modifications are adaptations that change what students learn and are used with students who require more support or adjustments than accommodations can provide. So when we think about the populations, we may look at those populations where there's some severe disability, and we may need, in fact, to change the playing field. Not level the playing field. Those accommodations that we provide level the playing field, but here we're changing the playing field, and we may, in fact, be changing what students learn and how they go about learning it. Unlike accommodations, modifications do change the expectations for learning, and they do reduce the requirements of the task. Let's look at some examples for modifications. Earlier we talked about ADHD. As you can see in this chart, ADHD still has the problem of remaining focused, but instead of providing extended time, which would allow them to answer exactly the same test, just have more time to do it, here we would give fewer homework questions so that the attention can be taken care of, the attention problems and remaining focus can be taken care of by a shorter assignment. Therefore, it would be changing what the student was required to do, and in fact, that puts it in the modification category rather than an accommodation category. Others on this list show you the same exact thing. For example, visual disability, reading printed text, we wouldn't read the same text, we would give you an alternate assignment. Or if we're talking about specific learning disability, we're looking to read a lower level book than decoding the text that is maybe on grade level text. So therefore, accommodations and modifications really do differ, and how they differ is very, very important to understand as we go forward in providing all that we can provide for our students. So now let's talk a little bit about testing accommodations. Testing accommodations are changes to the format of the test, providing the test in large print or its administration procedures, permitting extended time to complete the test. Testing accommodations change how students are tested, but not what the test measures. So you can see how accommodations in the classroom and accommodations in testing situations kind of mirror one another in that we are still not changing what the student learns or what they're able to show that they've learned. Students with disabilities who receive testing accommodations are required to take the same assessment and reach the same level of proficiency as students who do not use them. So here in this slide we see a series of presentation accommodations that might be provided. It's not an exhaustive list. However, when we're talking about how we present the material to the student, we may provide large print, magnification, sign language braille, tactile graphics, human readers, audio tape, or audio amplification devices may be provided in presentation. And here we see some examples of response accommodations, how the student's going to respond to the test itself. And this is going to level the playing field for them to be able to respond in a manner that's going to show what they learn and what they know. So you could see that scribe could be a possibility, word processor, tape recorder, responding to the test booklet, monitoring of test responses if answer sheet is used, the use of calculators, spelling and grammar devices, those types of things that would allow the student to respond to the test questions in a level playing field so that they can show what they've learned. In this slide we see the setting accommodations that may be needed for leveling the playing field. If we have students that need reduced distractions, if we have students that have limited physical access, so we may need to move where the test is actually being given, or we may need to place a student in a place where they can use special equipment. Maybe the room's not large enough, or whatever, we would have to consider all those things in providing those setting accommodations to students so that they can access the test and demonstrate, in fact, what they have learned. In this slide, we see timing and scheduling is the issue. And this is a situation where we would discuss, do we need extended time? Do the students need multiple or frequent breaks? Do we have a change in the schedule or the order of activities in order to level the playing field? In the IEP meeting and in the documentation, there is an accommodations determination form that's housed in Infinite Campus. For each meeting where an IEP is drafted or revised, members must consider accommodations that are appropriate and then provide supporting evidence, data, progress monitoring, test scores, things of that nature to verify that in fact the student needs the accommodation on the test. And it is clear to note that these accommodations are to be provided in accordance with the limitations set forth by the testing vendor. On the accommodations form, you will see that the accommodations must meet the following items. The accommodation is considered a temporary strategy, and a plan to fade those accommodations from the student as they become more proficient and independent in their work should be in place. And then it would explain the ARC's plan for fading those accommodations. And then we need to also keep in fact that the accommodations that we're providing do not impact the content validity being measured, and we've talked a lot about that earlier, about how it should in fact measure what the student has learned, and it shouldn't change the validity of the test, so that what they're learning and what they're being tested on is the same. The accommodations are age appropriate, are clearly in the student's education plan. The accommodations for the purpose of student accessing the general education curriculum. The accommodations allow students to demonstrate what they know and are able to do independently, and they shall in no way lead a student to the correct answer. Things to consider when looking at the accommodations determination form is that each student should be provided these accommodations based on individual need and not on disability category. Let me explain a little bit. So for whatever particular disability category the student might have, it may be appropriate for them to have all the accommodations, or it may be appropriate for them to have just a few of those accommodations. Let's take, for example, the category of mild mental disability. Sometimes when we look at those categories, we would say, yes, in fact, this student needs all of the accommodations, when in fact they may not need a scribe because they can and do have the physical ability to write, and that they can in fact form sentences, and they may have higher scores in that regard, and that may be a strength for them on their present level. So we have to go individual by individual. We have to look at each accommodation as being needed and necessary for that student to be able to show what they know. It's also important to remember that accommodations do not substitute for high quality instructional practice. We need to still continue to work to teach students to read, and that the reader is not to take the place of that good high quality instruction. For example, evaluation information or ongoing progress data supports the need for these accommodations, and we need to go to great lengths to describe why we are using these accommodations and why they're part of the student's ongoing instructional program, and that they have not been introduced immediately prior to the state, just so that the student can do well on the test. Caution is used here prior to making education plan changes related to accommodations near or within the state required assessment window. However, I will tell you that if a student's evaluation does in fact find them to have the need for an accommodation, you can make that accommodation, and you can choose that accommodation if you have the verifiable data to back that. So there are several things that the accommodations determinations form will capture as you do your ARC meetings. A discussion needs to be around several of these things that are mentioned here in this slide. For example, the use of technology. We need to make sure that we're always providing the opportunity for technology in place of adult accommodations. We need to also make mention that a shortage of workstations, software, physical space, or training shall not be used as a reason for failing to provide assistive technologies and accommodation. And then you have to explain, if you did in fact use an adult accommodation instead of technology, why did you do that? And then test administrators will be informed of all student accommodations, as well as the student will be informed of all those prior to the state required assessment to ensure that student needs are met. Changing in the administration of the assessment or recording of student responses are consistent with the instructional strategies in the student's education plan. And then the selection of accommodations is based on data analysis that you need to capture and document either in the form or in the ARC minutes, or both places. In these next few slides, we're going to look at all the different accommodations that can be chosen and be provided, in fact, in the IEP. The first one that we're looking at here is assistive technology device, and we know that that device is any type of equipment that might be provided for the student that will increase their functional capability on the test and in the classroom. And in fact, there are other things that you need to document in that ARC meeting. You need to document whether this student really needs this and it's verified by data, and how are they going to be using it on a routine basis during instruction, and that the progress data supports the need for this technology. The application form itself, you are to check all that apply in your use of the technology that would be provided. Now, this is not an exhaustive list, as you can add other types of technology, but there's certainly some here to consider and to help guide your thinking as you move through. And you can see that you would check any that apply in regards to your choice of assistive technology for this student. After carefully considering each of these choices, then one would need to document that the student in fact has a disability that would require the use of assistive technology, and the reasons why assistive technology was selected. Later in the training, we'll talk about some of that supporting evidence and how you're to document that and where you're to find that. Another such accommodation is manipulatives. The ARC has considered under what conditions a student will use manipulatives during instruction. Evaluation information and progress data need to be documented that support the need for manipulatives, and then specify how the manipulatives are to be used. In supporting evidence, you will verify the disability, and then you will also talk about the need for hands-on materials for learning and demonstrating learning, and the reasons manipulatives were selected as an accommodation. Documented here are things that are allowed and not allowed for a human reader. A reader shall read the directions, prompts, situations, passages, and stories as written in all parts of the assessment. They're not to provide any additional information that may lead the student to information that could help answer the question. They are allowed to reread the directions, prompts, situations, and passages, but only if the student requests. They're not to point out parts of the task, questions, or parts of the text skipped by the student, and they are to read individual words or abbreviations that are mispronounced by text or screen readers if specifically requested by the student. So in the accommodations form, there are some additional requirements for the use of a reader, and they are the following. The use of a reader is not solely dependent upon the student's grade level performance or the student's cognitive ability. Documentation confirms that over time, with intervention and high-quality instruction, that the student continues to need a reader because they are unable to access the reading assessment without the use of that such reader. The use of the reader is not a replacement for reading instruction. Instructions related to the reading performance is not replaced by accommodations. The ARC will consider under what conditions on a routine basis during instruction the student will use a reader or special materials as checked below. Evaluation information and progress data support the need for a reader. So in selecting this accommodation of reader, there are some ways in which we can provide this, and we need to let the ARC and the state know which way we're going to be providing this reader. And so these additional considerations would be to look at whether or not we're using audio technology, assistive technology, braille, large print, or are we in fact using a human reader. So we would need to make a note of that as we verify these accommodations. Other additional information may need to be answered in the use of a reader as an accommodation. We ask ourselves these questions as we consider the use of a reader. For all printed material, are we using the reader? Are we using the reader when reading content material is written on an age-appropriate grade level? Are we using a reader when reading content materials written above the student's independent reading level? Are we using a reader when we're receiving direct instruction in reading? Are we using a reader under a time constraint? So when ARCs have in fact chosen an accommodation, one of the things that they are charged with is providing information that verifies the disability exists, and then some anecdotal information and test scoring information that supports the need for the use of a reader. So we collect data around the need for a use of a reader on the state test, and there are several places we can look to verify the need for that. Simply saying that the child is disabled is not enough. We need to collect information from reading assessments and progress monitoring, ongoing progress monitoring under a time constraint. And then we need to also think about providing information around scores that we get from accommodated testing, and then scores that we get when the student is not receiving the accommodation. That's a great piece of information to have when you're trying to support your evidence for the need for a reader. It will show that when the accommodation is not made, then the student is not able to show what they know and are not on a level playing field. Now, when we're looking at scores, of course, we're going to look at the IQ score. We're going to look at the Verbal Comprehension Index on the WISC-5 if the student has been given that, the VCI score, if you will. And we're going to see that anytime you have a low score on Verbal Comprehension Index, if those scores are in the 70s, then the student is going to have real difficulty reading on grade level. And so we're going to use that as a piece of evidence to support the need for a reader if the student has scores in that area where they're low. And then we're going to look at the Working in Memory Index, and we're going to see that that type of low score would impact their ability to attend to task and to memorize information and to be able to comprehend information in a manner from the reading that they're doing. It also impacts what they hear and what they're able to process that way. So you would be looking at, if someone was oral reading to them, is that a way of, in fact, effectively getting your point across? So we would look to see if auditory processing is a problem, and this may be the need to be able to explain information in a much more detail. And so then we would, in fact, look at that as the possibility of providing a reader or not providing a reader. And then we would look at the processing speed index, because that too will tell us whether or not the student can fluently read and can answer questions under a time constraint, and how much of that processing speed index is going to impact those scores. Further, we would look for evidence in the achievement test scores, things like the White and the Woodcock-Johnson, that test students on basic reading. They test them on fluency, and they also test them on comprehension. We would look to see what those scores are. And then we would look maybe at the scores that the district may have from universal testing pursuits, like the STAR reading scores, where they give the test in the fall, and then they give it in the winter, and then they give it in the spring. And we see if those, in fact, all match up. And then that would give us a great impetus for providing a reader on the test. And also, we're going to look at making sure that documentation supports reading instruction as an ongoing accommodation in the IEP, and also looking at that it's included in the lesson plan. On the next few slides, we're going to look at what it means to have a scribe on the state test, and we're also going to look at some other considerations for using a scribe, and then also we're going to look at verifying the information that we need to verify in order to, in fact, say that the student needs the scribe. On this slide, We see that the use of a scribe during state-required assessment shall be limited to the following conditions. A student has a verified disability as documented in the IEP that is impacting written expression to a degree that the student's performance is significantly and consistently below the level of same-age peers. A student is unable to translate thoughts into written language and is not able to print, use cursive techniques, or use technology. A student is able to translate thoughts into written language but is not able to print, use cursive techniques, or use technology. In using a scribe should only record what the student dictates word for word. They should format, capitalize, and punctuate the student's writing as directed by the student. Give the written product to the student to edit or revise. Not alter, edit, or revise the student's own ideas, revisions, or edits. Interpreters who are also scribes shall follow the policies on scribing. Interpreters must adhere to the grammatical equivalent of English without adding to or elaborating on the content. From the accommodations determination form, there are some additional requirements that we need to consider when we document the use of a scribe in ARC meetings and on the IEP. The scribe is not used as a replacement for writing instruction or assistive technology. The ARC has documented the disability's impact on writing. The ARC considered under what conditions on a routine basis during instruction that the student will use the scribe or supplementary aids as checked below, and evaluation information and progress data support the need for a scribe. In choosing a scribe, we are to further define how we're going to use that scribe. Are we going to apply that through assistive technology, through an audio recorder, a communication board, a note taker, a braille writer, or a human scribe? Here's some examples of how a scribe might be used. For pre-writing activities while brainstorming ideas as directed by the student. When instruction and classroom assessments in the content area require a written response, or when instruction and classroom assessments or both involve a time constraint. As with the use of any accommodation, admissions and release committee meetings should look for supporting evidence for the use of a scribe. We always need to include a verifiable disability that in that documentation shows that the student has the inability to get their thoughts down on paper, or their disabling condition is such that they physically cannot do the writing. Further, if you're choosing a scribe, a human scribe over a technology, then you would need to also provide information that shows that the student is incapable physically of writing or doing the writing process. Now, when we turn our attention to scores as verifiable data to support our choice of providing a scribe for the student, we would look at first the intellectual scores, like things like on the processing speed or the verbal comprehension, which is going to in fact impact the ability to write, and then also the ability to write under a time constraint and the ability to organize thoughts. So if our intellect is diminished to the point that we would have difficulty in getting our thoughts down on paper, and we have that documented over repeated assessments, we would also look at achievement test scores. We would look at curriculum-based measures that we provide scores with and without accommodations to show the adverse effect that exists and the need for a scribe. We would look to see also, does the student qualify for occupational therapy? And if that therapy is needed for the lack of strength and precision that would impede the motor process of writing. So there are many things to consider here. The physical aspect of it, the intellectual aspect of it. You're going to look at all those and you're going to document the information in support of a verifiable disability and in support of data that in fact verifies that disability and says that the student in fact needs a scribe in order to put them on a level playing field to show what they know on the state test. Accommodation that we have to consider is the use of a calculator. The use of a calculator is allowed on all sections of the state required assessment, including those sections labeled non-calculator, if in fact a student has the need for a calculator in their IEP, and it's documented by verifiable information. And we would note that the accommodations set here, the accommodations should be provided in accordance with the limitations set forth by the testing vendor so that the validity of the test is not impacted. So the ARC additional requirements would be that they would document the disability's impact on mathematics, calculation, and reasoning, that the ARC would consider under what conditions the student will use a calculator on a routine basis during instruction, and that the evaluation information and progress data support the need for a calculator. The calculator is not used as a replacement for mathematics instruction. So all that needs to be documented and carefully considered as we move forward and we choose to use a calculator on state tests and in our daily instruction. So there are several things we can look at to verify supporting evidence for the use of a calculator. We have to understand that we're looking at low scores around achievement tests in math, basic math skills. We're looking at their ability to apply math, apply reasoning, and to look at those scores that are provided for us through academic achievement testing or maybe district universal test scores around basic math skills and math application scores and reasoning scores. Going further below the surface, we would look at those intellectual scores around working memory. We would look at the visual spatial index, the VSI, if we're taking geometry. We would look to see if the working memory is impacted so that we can't remember the steps or we can't remember the basic facts to in fact complete the higher level math problems. We would look at fluid reasoning scores. We would look to see if there was a low score there. We know that the ability to quantitatively reason would be impacted. We know that applying all these formulas and remembering these formulas, remembering the basic math facts, are impacted if we have low scores in these areas. Therefore, we would need the use of a calculator to put us on a level playing field. We would also look at fluid reasoning scores. In a sense, those fluid reasoning scores impact our ability to form patterns and see things in abstract. So we need to also keep that in mind as we look to verify the use of a calculator and how we're going to use that not only ongoing in our instruction, but also applying it to the use on state tests. Another accommodation that a student can have on the state test is paraphrasing. Now we have to keep in mind that paraphrasing is only for directions. You do not paraphrase any type of content or question once the test begins. However, you are able to paraphrase for students in regards to those directions by using similar words or phrases in those directions, breaking those directions down into smaller parts or chunking those directions so that students can understand them, and also repeating or rephrasing those directions. In applying paraphrasing, we shall not include defining words or concepts, teaching vocabulary, or telling a student what to do first, second, etc. Reading passages and content passages may not be paraphrased as they would impact content validity. We want to know what the student knows, and by paraphrasing, we are helping them to understand the directions so that because the test may be a little foreign to them, we need to make sure that they understand directly what they are to do. So we put them on a level playing field by paraphrasing the directions. We do not paraphrase the content of the test so as to not mess with the validity of that test and the content of that test. Additional requirements for paraphrasing: we shall not be using this paraphrasing as a replacement for reading, listening, or oral communication instruction. And the ARC considered under what conditions the student will be needing this paraphrasing on a routine basis during instruction. And then we're going to verify that. As always, we have to provide that progress data support that shows that we need paraphrasing. It is important for the ARC to document supporting evidence around the use of all of these accommodations, including paraphrasing. So when we're verifying the disability that exists and the need for understanding information or remembering reading material, oral and written questions, or oral communication, and the reason paraphrasing was selected as an accommodation, we need to look a little deeper below the surface. We need to look to the scores on the WISC, on the intellectual assessment that students have that make them eligible for IEPs, and to see that there is a diminished ability to comprehend verbal information, as we would see in the BCI score, a diminished ability to read, understand concepts, listening comprehension, all reflected in VCI scores, can be supporting evidence for the need for paraphrasing. Diminished working memory scores on the list, with particular deficiencies in auditory processing, being able to process what's being read effectively. If you have a deficiency there, that would be another good reason for documenting why you are using a paraphraser. And as always, you want to list all those reasons why there is a need for paraphrasing. In some instances, a student may benefit from the use of extended time. Now, one additional requirement is that we see that the student is using the time that we have given them, and that they're making or demonstrating on-task efforts which allow the student to make constructive progress on completing the assessment responses. Now, we also know that the ARC considered under what conditions a student will need extended time during instruction should be provided in the explanation. We know that in the explanation they should provide evaluation information and progress data that support the need for extended time. And then the ARC has to determine the extent of the extended time and what will be the rate of the extended time. Will it be time and a half, or will it be double time? So supporting evidence will also be needed to document the need for extended time on test. We verify that a disability exists. We look at which results would be impacted by extended time or the lack thereof. And then we would look at WIS scores for processing speed. When processing speed scores are deficient, then students would have difficulties with finishing these tasks in a timely manner, and that would be a good, clear indicator of a need for extended time. The degree there of the processing speed difficulties would also help one to determine if there was a need for time and a half or double time. So we would then look at progress monitoring, and we would see had there been any direct measures like the use of duration recordings or latency recordings that have been taken for the ability to sustain attention or initiate a task. We would look at task completion logs. Do the students complete their task in the time that's given, or do they not complete those tasks? And are there intellectual reasons why those students may not be completing those tasks in a timely manner? Deficient intellect will impact the ability to process information and to be able to in fact answer questions and problems on test in a timely fashion. We'd also look at fine motor difficulties to see if there was any impact in their ability to write and manipulate the test in a way that they would be able to do that with in the sufficient amount of time that's been provided. So there's lots of things to consider there on extended time, and of course we're always going to look at their reading and their math and their fluency scores from achievement tests, and also from any test that had been timed where we see deficient scores as a result of the disability.
When considering additional requirements for the reinforcement and behavior modification strategies, the ARC would consider under what conditions a student would need that reinforcement behavior modification strategy on a routine basis during instruction, and then they would provide some verification of data to provide the evaluation information that's needed to support the use of that on state test. So when the ARC meeting is occurring, you would have a discussion to verify when this reinforcement and behavior modification strategy is needed and that it's verified by data, but then also how you're going to use it. How are you going to apply it? Are you going to apply it in these ways when verbal and tangible or tactile reinforcements for being on task are used, when you're using technology to focus attention or reduce stress, or if you're testing in a separate location outside the classroom. You would consider all those and check the ones that apply to the certain individual that you are in fact discussing these reinforcement strategies about in that ARC meeting. So as with all of the previous accommodations that we have talked about, you still will continue to see here that we'll need to verify the disability that occurs or that is existing around the use of this reinforcement of behavior modification strategies. And we will look at behavior information. We will look at if there's an existing behavior intervention plan. We'll look at the use of behavior goals when it applies to this student. We'll answer that question: does this student's disability cause him to behave in such a way that's going to impact others and himself in terms of what they're learning and what they're able to show that they've learned? And then we would remember it may not be just the EBD student that qualifies. This can apply to any disability category if in fact the behavior that the student is exhibiting is in fact causing the students around him or himself to have their learning impacted. So we would be looking at those categories. We'd also look at the ADHD and OHI categories that have need for small group instruction. We would make sure that the goals support the verified disability. We see here on this slide that there are some questions to consider, and we would always think about assistive technology. If we can use that, we would use that as a first option, and we would here for an interpreter of a student with deafness or hearing impairment, we would look to see that we're not using this interpreter as a replacement for assistive technology. If that student can have that technology available to them, and they can and always will, then they should be able to use that first and foremost, and we would not just put the interpreter, the human interpreter, in place when there is assistive technology that's available that would take care of the student's disability and the disabling condition so that they can test and show what they know. We would also have to verify the disability in the area of hearing to the degree that the student's development of language is significantly impacted. We need to also see that the student uses sign language as a normal mode of communication due to his or her disability, and verify that and document that. And then also the ARC has considered under what conditions a student will need to use this interpreter on a routine basis during instruction, because that's always a stipulation for the use of that on the state test. Is it an ongoing practice? Is it something they're doing all the time? Maybe not daily, but at least ongoing. And then does the evaluation information again and progress data support the need for an interpreter in this particular case? There are also some additional things to consider when looking at this use of an interpreter. We know that the interpreter shall not indicate correct answers to the test items, define words for the student, provide content, teach vocabulary concepts, or any way in their interpreting lead a student to the correct answer. We want to know what the student knows, and we want the interpreter to be there in such a way that they would level the playing field for the student and allow them to show what they know, not what the interpreter knows. Interpreters who also are scribes shall follow the policies on scribing outlined in this document, and then also interpreters must adhere to the grammatical equivalent of English without adding to or elaborating on the content. So just as in all the other accommodations considerations and determinations, we apply this to the hearing impairments accommodation as well. Looking for supporting evidence, we verify that the disability is there, and the verified disability really shows us the need for an interpreter and why we have to use an interpreter as a selected accommodation. We need to look at answering whether or not technology could take the place of the interpreter. We need to look at the hearing impairment degree, and if there are any mitigating measures that would allow the use of those assistive technologies like amplification devices and etc. We would certainly use those, and we would always remember to consider technology first. So as we come to the end of this training, we have some things that we need to think about, and some things that we certainly should have learned as a result of this training. We are going to have a quiz here at the end, and we'll also be able to provide you with a PD credit So certainly this is something that hopefully you will be able to demonstrate that you have learned through the answering the questions on the quiz. You'll be able have this housed on theholler.org here at KVEC, and you'll be able to refer back to it if you need to. Certainly, you can provide us some feedback in the open-ended question at the end of the quiz to let us know how we could have done some things much better. We appreciate your time, and as we look at this, we understand that we've been able to compare accommodations modifications and determine the difference. We should have learned the difference between those, and we've looked at equity and equality and should know the difference when applying it to the use of accommodations. And then we've looked at the ARC responsibility around the use of accommodations. So thank you for your time, and certainly we hope that this has been beneficial to you